Everyone to the Early Childhood Education Research Alliance's first webinar. We just came together at the beginning of January, and so we're excited about this presentation. We're excited about our speakers today. As Peter said, I'm Jackie Barassa. I serve as the Alliance's facilitator, and I'm a former kindergarten teacher, so I have a personal interest in the conversations and discussions today.
I've been doing my research and months and months.
I will be moderating today's session. I think there's a participant who may not be on mute, so I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So if everybody could just make sure that their phones are muted, that would be helpful. Thank you so much. So I'd like to begin so we can get through the agenda as quickly as possible. We do have a full agenda today, and our speakers, Catherine Scott Little, Sherry Killens, and Jerry St. Gillet, are linked to this particular topic of early childhood assessment in 3 different ways. They're going to present 3 different perspectives. We're going to hear about early childhood assessment from the national perspective and what research Catherine has been doing, the state perspective and what Massachusetts has been doing and Sherry's been leading. And Jerry's going to give us the classroom level perspective where she's done some exciting work in her classroom in New Hampshire. I'll just review these slides briefly before we begin. Most of you are aware, and Peter has reiterated, that the United States Department of Education funds a network of 10 educational labs across the country to serve the education needs of a particular region. The laboratories provide access to valid education research through applied research studies and related technical assistance activities. As Peter said, the REL in Northeastern Islands, we refer to REL-NEI, serves all the New England states, New York, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I'd also like to acknowledge our primary partners. The American Institutes for Research is a primary partner on our particular alliance. Anne-Marie Ferrier from AIR is our alliance researcher. We also are working with other partners in very specific roles. For example, School Readiness Consulting has collaborated with the alliance in the planning of this webinar, so we'd like to extend our thanks to them. As members of the Alliance have tried to define their work and the scope of the work over the next 5 years, we've actually started with a broad vision and a goal, and here is the goal that we keep refining it as we're defining the work and as we're looking at the research agenda. And so this is the latest version of that vision. So the broad vision of our Early Childhood Education Research Alliance is to bring together the region's early childhood stakeholders, and we're united in that pursuit of improving early childhood programming and children's outcomes through research and evidence-based practices. We're in the process right now of co-creating the research agenda that's articulated in this broad vision, and it focuses on standards, practices, and assessment in early childhood education. So let's just take a quick look at the webinar goals. Today we're going to describe the research base and types of kindergarten readiness assessments and other early childhood assessments being used nationally. Discuss how these assessments are being used to help instructional decisions. To provide a state-level perspective, which Sherry Killens will do for Massachusetts, on selecting and implementing kindergarten readiness assessments. And then Jerry will round out the presentations with a classroom level perspective of how these assessments are used to make instructional decisions. So before we begin, we'd just like to have a brief poll of what state or territory are you representing today? Very good. I didn't even have to review the directions on how to use the poll. So it looks like we have quite a few people from Massachusetts. And I'm personally from Rhode Island, so I'm glad to see that Ruth is on and Rhode Island is represented. And it looks like all the members in our particular alliance are represented. We have members in the alliance from all the New England states, New York, and the Virgin Islands. So we're very happy to see that. And it looks like we actually have some people who are from outside, 3 people who are from outside a particular region. So we'd like to welcome you also and hope that you'll gain some information and some perspective of what we're doing in our alliance, and hopefully you'll continue to monitor our progress and participate in our upcoming events. So I think we can close the poll. It looks like people have weighed in. Thank you, Dominique, for doing that. And we are pleased to welcome the 3 distinguished speakers that we have with us today. Because each is so accomplished: Catherine Scott Little from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, Sherry Killens from the Commissioner of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts, and Jerry St. Gelais from New Hampshire, and she's from the Milan Village School, SAU number 20, which is, I'm from Rhode Island, so we're very urban, so I really don't understand what that means, but it sounds like it's a rural district. Because each is so accomplished, I will present a brief bio before each speaker begins. Please notice that each presentation will be followed by a brief discussion. You may wish to type a question in the participants chat as we're going along and each speaker is presenting. So without further ado, I think that we can certainly begin. Let me first just introduce Catherine. You have bullets from her bio there, but I'd like to read the bio to you. Catherine Scott Little is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Catherine has collaborated on several national studies to examine early learning standards and assessments. In addition to her research on assessments, Catherine has done extensive research and published studies related to early childhood teacher preparation and professional development. Catherine has also worked as a researcher with the SERVE Center for Continuous Improvement, where she studied large-scale assessment systems states have developed to collect data on their school readiness programs. She has co-authored several publications on the topic of assessment, including a review of methods and instruments used in state and local school readiness evaluations and assessing the state of state assessments, perspectives on assessing young children. Catherine completed her undergraduate degree in child development and family relations at UNC Greensboro and earned a doctorate degree in human development at the University of Maryland at College Park. Prior to joining UNC Greensboro, Catherine managed a child development program for homeless children and was deputy director of a large Head Start program in Texas. Catherine began conducting early childhood research and providing training for early childhood professionals when she joined UNC Greensboro as a SERVE staff member in 1999. She joined the HDS faculty as an assistant professor in 2003. Catherine, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here today, to be a representative of the Southeast among all this diversity and geography that we have represented, and to talk a bit from the research that I've done over the course of about a decade to look at state assessment systems. And so what I'm going to do in today's presentation is talk just a bit about what are some important ideas, or the basics, if you will, related to assessments. Then we'll look at some trends in kindergarten entry assessments. And for our purposes, we're thinking of a kindergarten entry assessment as a system for collecting data from children and other sources at the time that children enter kindergarten and, in some cases, into the kindergarten year. So we'll be talking about kindergarten entry assessments as a system that often includes assessment instruments to collect data from children directly, but also is an opportunity to get a broader picture of where children are coming from and collect other types of information from families. So when we think of a kindergarten entry assessment, we really think of a system that yields data that's useful for a number of different purposes. And I'm going to talk about some of the trends that we've seen in kindergarten entry assessments, as well as some considerations to keep in mind. So first, just a summary of some important points to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about related to assessments. One thing that is very important to keep in mind is that there are different purposes that we use assessment for. The data that we gather from children can be used as a screening purpose. And a screening is really a brief assessment to identify children with potential disabilities. It typically takes place at one point in time and yields very useful information, but not comprehensive information about a child's learning and development. A second purpose is for instruction, to be helpful to teachers as they plan, as they implement their curriculum, and then they evaluate how it's going. So instructional assessments or formative assessments are really designed to be useful for teachers. A third purpose that we might be doing assessment for is to monitor trends across groups of children. And so for these assessments, it's more to give us a picture of where children as a group are and any particular issues that might be important for improving services. A final purpose is for high stakes or for accountability, and that's really to discern how a program has done, or in some cases, a teacher. Now, I bring this up because this is very important in terms of assessment systems, and we always want to make sure that we're clear on our purpose and that the assessment that we're using is actually designed for that purpose. There are also different types of assessment or ways that we might collect assessment data. We might collect data from children directly, often one-on-one, where someone sits down with a child. We might use portfolios to collect children's work or pictures or other documentation of what they're doing over time, and that's particularly useful to teachers as they design instruction. There are also observational assessments, which means someone, the teacher or someone else, spends time observing and recording what they see children do. And then finally, there are written reports that teachers might fill out and or parents might fill out. Each of these types of data collection have pros and cons. They each can yield useful data, and they all can be a part of a kindergarten entry assessment system. An important thing to think about before we begin talking about kindergarten entry assessments is that the kindergarten entry assessment should be a part of or fit within a larger or broader assessment system. And so this quote is here from the Race to the Top proposal, and it pointed out that indeed kindergarten entry assessments are collecting data at a certain point in time when children enter kindergarten, but that they should fit within the overall system in terms of how they are collecting the data and how the data are used. So those are some basic ideas related to kindergarten entry assessments. And in general, as someone who watches states and watches policy, I can say that we've seen a lot of activity around kindergarten entry assessments recently. A lot of states were in the process of developing one or considering one, but when Race to the Top came out, it placed a great deal of priority on kindergarten entry assessments. So we saw states that were on the brink of thinking about this really put their toe in the water and begin to consider it seriously, and states that were already working on something kind of ratcheted it up. So in terms of data of where we are now, we do have 43 states that either described some plans for a KEA in their Race to the Top application, or they didn't have an application, but they already had a kindergarten entry assessment system. So you can see that we have a number of different states that are at least thinking about this enough to write down a plan, and a number who are implementing a system. There's a wide variety of the types of instruments used, how the data are used, and what is assessed as part of the kindergarten entry assessments when we look across the states. Everything from just a parent survey to a more complex child assessment is being used. The one commonality is that the kindergarten teacher is generally the go-to person who's responsible for collecting the data, because they're the ones that have the closest connection to the children and families when they enter kindergarten. Now we have some states, like in New Hampshire that you'll hear from later, that don't have, at this point, a statewide system for collecting kindergarten entry assessment data. And in those states, school districts and teachers are doing a great job of thinking about how to do this, and you're going to hear an example later. But we do have some other states that are trying out or designing and, in some cases, fully implementing a statewide system to collect data from children. And just to give you some examples of the variety, we have states here in your region that are using a teacher survey, such as in Connecticut and Vermont. Some that have done, at least in the past, a sample of children with a direct assessment. The Learning Accomplishment Profile, 3rd edition, was used in the Virgin Islands. And then some states are relying on teacher observations and work sampling kinds of systems to collect data. And the state of Maryland is an example of that type of system. So the websites that are listed there are places that you can go to if you'd like to learn more about what these states are doing. I did want to point out a couple of examples of what might be some new thinking or some innovation around kindergarten entry assessment. In Washington State, they have designed a kindergarten entry assessment system which really puts the transition process at the heart of what's going on. So it's much more than just collecting data from children, but they are thinking of the KEA as both an opportunity to collect data and a process to help ease children and families into the kindergarten experience. And that's kind of a different way of thinking about a kindergarten entry assessment. It's more than collecting data, but it's part of the transition process. We also have a couple of states, Maryland and Ohio, that are beginning a planning process where they are working toward using a combination of different types of assessments. So a combination of teacher observations and some direct assessments. Typically, most states have used one or the other, and so this is somewhat of an innovation in how we think about collecting data from children. And then in your own region, Massachusetts, as well as Pennsylvania, are working toward a system where different entities, be it the school district or a program, have some choice in what kind of assessment instrument they use, and then the state is working on a system to take data from the different instruments and combine it in a way that makes the data useful, even though it was collected differently. So that is both intellectually challenging and an innovation in kindergarten entry assessments. So that's sort of what's going on out there. But as I've watched states developing these systems, I have collected, and actually a number of different publications have been written on considerations that we need to keep in mind as we're designing kindergarten entry assessment systems. So you'll hear later, as people talk about what they're doing, that it's not easy. Designing a kindergarten entry assessment and implementing it is not easy, and there are a number of considerations that we have to keep in mind. And I'm going to talk about a few related to the instruments that we use, the instrumentation, and I'm also going to talk about some considerations for implementation, or how we actually get it in the field, and then finally some policy considerations. So first, related to instrumentation, I mentioned earlier that the purpose of an assessment is very important. And the reason it is important is because assessments are designed generally for specific purposes, and that's usually they're tested out for that particular purpose. And when you begin to use an assessment for a different purpose, you really don't know if the data that it's providing are valid and credible. So keeping in mind what was the purpose for which the assessment was designed is very important. Our second consideration related to instrumentation is the technical properties of an instrument, the reliability and the validity. And these are properties that are established through research and speak to the credibility of the instrument and the data it produces. And we're in a bit of a quandary because we have some instruments that have good technical properties, but in some areas of children's development, we have limited choice in instruments that actually have a proven track record with reliability and validity. So this is a continuing challenge for the field. Another consideration is that you really want to make sure that the instrument you choose is appropriate for the children who will be assessed. Particularly when we think about children who are dual language learners, children from different cultural backgrounds, and children with disabilities, we want to make sure that the instrument was actually tested out with those children and that there is guidance for how to assess children from different backgrounds, as well as guidance on how to use the data that are collected from these children. So it's very important to think about who am I assessing, and is this assessment a good match for that group? And then finally, we want assessments to be useful to teachers. And in at least some of the considerations in that area are they need to be aligned with the standards that have defined what teachers should be teaching and aligned with the curricula or curriculum that teachers are using and how they're teaching. And finally, user-friendly, something that teachers can do without a lot of trouble, or at least not an overburden, and produce data that are relevant and meaningful to what they're doing in the classroom. So when we're thinking about how to choose an instrument, these are important considerations. Now, when it comes to implementation and actually getting people to do it and to report the data, we want it to be useful for teachers and other stakeholders because we want them to. And I think we've seen in a number of states that if the teachers and other stakeholders don't buy into the assessment or the assessment system, it will not be a system. So an important consideration is buy-in from stakeholders. Then there's professional development, which is a key to any assessment system. And we need to think about training teachers or whoever will do the assessment to do the assessment correctly. And you see there a bullet labeled certification. And that is that we need to think about how do we document that teachers actually can implement the assessment correctly rather than just providing training and assuming that it's going to happen. Then another piece of professional development is the ongoing support and monitoring and training. It's not enough to do it once. You need ongoing support with teachers as they're trying it out. You need to be monitoring how they're doing and providing refresher training. And then additionally, we need professional development on how to use the data. So initially, we might train teachers on how to implement the assessment, but that ongoing use of the data is just as important because if teachers aren't finding it useful or don't know how to use the data, they're likely to stop implementing the assessment or to not do it to the full extent that the guidance calls for. So ongoing training, support, and professional development is very important, as well as quality control and continued evaluation of the data that are being collected to make sure that it is correct, accurate, and of high quality. So as we're thinking about implementation, these are key things to think about.
Catherine, I want to thank you so much. This is Jackie again. I want to thank you so much for all the thoughts that you've really put in my head personally. There are so many things to consider, and we're just going to take a quick poll right now and look at one particular piece. So we'd like to see the second poll, please. Thank you. And it's really around the issue of professional development that you just raised. Is your state or district planning professional development for teachers around using KEA data in the upcoming year? So if you could reply, we would appreciate it.
Thanks. We'll give you a minute to reply. And the reason that we've asked this question is because we know from experience that the professional development is key to the success of a kindergarten entry assessment system. So when we're thinking about implementation, we also, in addition to professional development, need to be thinking about professional development for administrators in addition to teachers, because we know that they provide the support, they set the tone, and they actually set teachers' priorities. And so if we leave administrators out, then teachers have a harder time doing the assessment well. We also need to keep in mind parent involvement as we're planning kindergarten entry assessments. Parents are a great source of information about their children, particularly in domains related such as physical development or concerns about potential disabilities. They're also great sources of information about children's social skills, things that teachers may not be able to discern immediately as they're entering kindergarten. Plus the fact that the assessment process provides opportunities to build parent relationships early in the transition process. So we see that kindergarten entry can be a key part of the kindergarten transition experience, as well as provide data on where children are. The final thing to think about related to implementation is really the data management plan and the system, and how are we going to take in, scrutinize, and then use the information that is coming from the kindergarten entry assessment. Let's take a moment and look at our poll.
So go ahead, Catherine. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. You can.
Looks like we have some folks that are thinking about implementation and professional development related to KEAs in their system, whether it's a state or school district. But we have a number of folks that just aren't sure. And that probably relates to some folks who do not have a state assessment system. So as we're looking at that, that's interesting to see that some have specific plans and others are still thinking about it or maybe don't know. So finally, as we think about our kindergarten entry assessments, we need to acknowledge that there are really a lot of pressures around kindergarten entry assessments. We find policymakers that want us to use kindergarten entry assessments for multiple purposes. So we're going to collect data from children, but we want teachers to be able to use it for instruction, and we want to be able to use it for accountability to see how programs are doing. That's very tricky and is something that even though there's pressure to do that, we have to be very careful about not doing that without making sure that we have a validation for each purpose, or that we've tested it out and know that the data are correct or credible in terms of being used for that purpose. We also see just plain increasing demands for data, but at the same time limited resources to support administration of the instruments. The data management systems are still in process, and sometimes we have limited attention to safeguards that are needed to protect children and families, their privacy, to protect them from misuse of results. And so as we have these pressures for more data and at the same time some limitations, I know that it can be difficult to develop a good kindergarten entry assessment that meets all the demands and upholds the principles for good assessment. And finally, with a lot of policy initiatives, we have limited time. Someone, whoever it may be, the legislature or the school system or whoever, often wants it done immediately. And so that's in kind of contradiction to what's needed to design a good system, because it does take time and stakeholder buyout, but it is a pressure that we have to realize. And in conclusion, what we really need from the big picture is additional research, because at this point, there really isn't data on whether we're doing this well and what factors help states as they develop kindergarten entry assessment systems. We're really doing the best that we can based on some good principles and based on data like what we saw about what other states are doing, but we have limited information on how well we're doing it. We also don't really know how the data are being used. And we need some research on making sure that these assessment systems that are using assessments for multiple purposes are actually valid for each of the purposes, and that the data are useful and credible for each of the purposes. And finally, we need some research to tell us whether this idea of implementing and using a kindergarten entry assessment actually makes a difference, whether the use of kindergarten entry data improves teaching practices and or child outcomes. Now, luckily, your REL is in the process of doing a study to examine just this, and to my knowledge, it's one of the first opportunities to systematically look at how KEA data, or the use of data from children when they enter kindergarten, might be related to teaching practices, or particularly related to child outcomes. And they are doing a study where they're looking at a large data set to test and see, does it make a difference in terms of child outcomes? And I personally will be on the edge of my seat waiting for the results from that. So what I've tried to do today is to set a context to tell us within our nation, we have a number of different states that are developing kindergarten entry assessment systems. It's complicated. There are a lot of different considerations to think about, and we are doing a lot of this work in absence of research to really guide us. So we have to really look at best practices and use our best judgment as we do that. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have questions.
This is Jackie again. Thank you, Catherine, for your insights and the issues that you've raised. It is challenging and it's very hard work, and I'm sure people will be following it as we move forward. I wanted to begin with just one question that was submitted at registration, and then it looks like we have some coming up in the chat. So let me just ask this one particular question. How do you determine the reliability and validity of your assessments for young children?
This is an important issue, and as I mentioned earlier, we have some reliability and validity data on a number of instruments, but not on all, and some areas of children's development we're stronger than others. So it is very important to look for reliability and validity data. These are the technical properties of an instrument that are based on the research that are done with the results from the instrument. Most instruments have a technical manual or a report on the web, and you really are going to want to study that carefully. If you can't find it, you can request it from the publisher. And what I really do recommend is that if you're someone who has a background in research, you can read some of those data, and you'll be looking for reliability coefficients, and really wanting, as a rule of thumb, those to be higher than 0.8 or above. But it is a technical kind of thing to look at reliability and validity data. So if you don't have a background in that, I really recommend you get some help from someone, either a researcher or in some cases a school psychologist, who really understands how to read the research data on an instrument. But it's really important, besides all the numbers and making sure that reliability coefficients are appropriate and that validity data have been collected, what you also need to look at is who was it collected on, and do the children that participated in that research look like or reflect the same children that you'll be assessing? Because if they don't, then you will have to sort of take those reliability and validity results with a grain of salt. So where do you go? You go to a technical manual. How do you read it? If you've got a background, you look for the reliability coefficients and other statistics. And if you don't, really seek out some help, because it's an important factor as you think about whether an assessment instrument is appropriate for your particular group of children that you're assessing.
Thank you, Catherine, for your response and all your insight into this particular topic. I just wanted to point out that there were a couple questions that came up in the chat. One of them is who is in charge of developing the design for and the content in KEAs. And want to point out that Sherry Killens, who is our next speaker, has actually answered the questions that were in the chat. So I hope participants will look at that. She talked about that kindergarten entry assessments are on entry to kindergarten, and that each state is designing the content for their particular assessment. So I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, which is part of my job as the moderator. So I'd like to, perhaps we'll have time at the end to continue this particular discussion, but I'd like to actually move the agenda so we can hear what Sherry has to say.
Thank you, Jackie.
Well, Sherry, do you mind if I read your bio? It is very impressive.
Okay.
Okay. So Dr. Sherry Killens is the Commissioner of Early Education and Care for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and a member of the REL-NEI Governing Board. Since 2009, Dr. Killens has provided leadership in designing and implementing a statewide method to define, measure, and communicate quality called the Quality Rating and Improvement System for Early Education and Care, out of school in multiple environments, including family child care, public schools, center-based, and Head Start. Dr. Killens has also positioned 4 statewide systems: mental health, educator and provider supports, community family engagement, and information and referral for early educators, children and their families, providers of early education, and out-of-school time services. Ooh, that's a lot of work, Sherry. Under her leadership, Massachusetts secured the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant. Dr. Killens has worked as an advocate for children and families in a variety of ways for more than 20 years, both as a provider of direct care and in leadership roles on issues relating to children and families. From 2006 to 2009, Dr. Killens has worked at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, an organization that promotes public policies, human service reforms, and community supports that more effectively meet the needs of today's vulnerable children and families. She's held several roles in that foundation. Her final position was serving as Vice President for Human Development and Operations. Prior to her work with the foundation, she served as the founding president, CEO of the New Haven Empowerment Zone, was a mayoral candidate in New Haven, Connecticut, and led operations and programs for both the Empowerment Zone Corporation and the Family Preservation Initiative of Baltimore. Dr. Killens holds a nursing degree from the University of Pittsburgh, a Master's of Administrative Science from Johns Hopkins University, and a doctorate in counseling psychology from the University of Sarasota. Since being appointed the Commissioner of Early Education and Care, Dr. Killens received a certificate from Harvard Graduate School of Education, Pre-K through 3, the Foundation for Educational Success Institute in 2010. Dr. Killens was appointed in 2011 to the Regional Advisory Committee under the U.S. Department of Education and appointed to the State's Commission on Postpartum Depression. In 2012, Dr. Killens received the Massachusetts Reading Association Legislative Award for her leadership in promoting early childhood literacy and Horizons for Homeless Children Public Service Award. she's also the mother of 3 daughters. Well, Sherry, I am dying to hear what you have to say about state implementation of the KES system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And next time I need to edit the long version, but thanks so much for that introduction.
I
Really
think that
excited.
was the short. I think that was the short version, Sherry.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to really be here and learn with you. What I want to do is talk about Massachusetts' larger context of the work, how we're thinking about a larger assessment system, as you heard Catherine mention, some of the purposes, some of the tools that we're using in our assessment system, how we're thinking about the kindergarten entry assessment, who some of the key players were in that work, as well as what are some of the other projects that need to be going on in order to be successful in doing a kindergarten entry assessment, as well as some of the considerations that we heard from the field, and honestly some of the hidden costs that you might not initially consider when starting to do a kindergarten entry assessment. So real excited to be here today. I'll try to go through this slowly, which those of you who know me know that'll be hard. In Massachusetts, we think about our work having really 4 buckets, working on educator and teacher quality, and we're now doing that in formal spaces as well as formal spaces. You heard about the quality rating and improvement system, our effort at building program quality over and above our very strong licensing standards. But we also know that we have to do that thinking about the context in the community and the families that we're working with. And we believe when we put all those things together, we'll get strong outcomes for children. But we need to have tools, as Catherine mentioned, in order to screen children as appropriate, as well as look at formative assessment and kindergarten assessment as a way to measure growth and ensure our children are growing. We talk about a Massachusetts early learning and development screening system for assessment that really begins in our informal spaces using the ASQ, which I'll talk about later, and moves all the way through formative assessment being used in formal spaces across all domains of learning in family, child care, and center-based, Head Start, public school, and then up to our kindergarten entry assessment. And we're real excited to be linking the space between kindergarten and second grade so that our ideas and our thoughts about kindergarten entry assessment move all the way through that formal assessment in the 3rd grade. But I am always grounded that this work needs to start with a tool that begins to provide information, collects information from families and provides information from families as they are the children's first teachers, and they'll be able to create additional opportunities. We then want to make sure that the tool gives information to improve teaching and learning and individualizes. We know when children enter kindergarten, they come with a variety of experiences and opportunities. And so we first want to make sure whatever tool we're using is creating high-quality evidence information that leads to high-quality teaching and learning. And then you can get program and quality improvement and use it for professional development plans for teachers, as well as you can understand communities and the kinds of local supports that might be necessary. And then we'll have good quality information for state policy. If teachers are really able to use the information, it'll be high quality. If we're using it to improve professional development and design our communities, then we'll have more information for state policy. So in our state, I think about 450,000 children who really need an opportunity to be screened, not to seek developmental delays, but rather to help families understand the multiple dimensions of development and what they can be doing to move children forward. And that can happen in pediatric spaces. We now have it happen in libraries and in play groups and other places throughout the community. We also, in our quality rating and improvement system, know that we need to pay attention to the environments where children are. So we're also doing environmental assessments and assessments of adult-child interactions when children are in formal spaces. And in those formal spaces, we expect that programs are using a formative assessment, again, to understand where that individual child is, where they need to continue to grow, and to measure that they're getting towards that growth. So there are lots of assessments in our system, and as Catherine mentioned out, this is very tricky. They're not all perfect, but for us it was easier to select something that was off the shelf that we believed met the needs of the population we were working with, other than the fact that most of these tools don't do very well around dual language learners, and we'll talk about that later. But we're using Ages and Stages questionnaire and Ages and Stages social emotional for screening. We're using the Eckers set because it goes across infants and toddlers and family, child care, and center-based and after school. We're using the Arnett and class. Either one of those are a choice in our quality rating and improvement system to talk to us about teacher-child interactions. And in doing our formative assessments, we're using work sampling, teaching strategies goal, and high scope. These are the same three tools that we built our kindergarten entry assessment system off of. And in our work with early intervention, or Part C, and our partnership with IDEA for preschool, we've also been doing a fair amount of training around the Battelle because that was a tool that EI and public schools were using, and it made it easier to communicate as some of those children transitioned in the public school preschool. So when you think about our Massachusetts kindergarten entry assessment, I always like to say there really isn't one. There wasn't an off-the-shelf tool. What we're trying to do in Massachusetts is train kindergarten teachers to use formative assessment well. And we believe they've been observing and collecting information in all of these domains every day. What we're now giving them is a package in order to put that data and information. And that if they do that in a quality way and with reliability, that'll inform instruction and curriculum. And the state will then allow the districts to pick which one they want to use, and we will then create a single way to look at all three of those assessments to see if we can find constructs across them that are similar to use to have a measure of kindergarten entry across our state. It's important to us, though, that that kindergarten entry is viewed as a single point and that it is connected to what's going on in preschools when possible and certainly what goes on through second grade. There were lots of players that had to agree for us to be able to do our kindergarten entry assessment. Catherine's right. We're one of those states that didn't think we were ready to think about it until Race to the Top came along and really made it a requirement. But we needed quickly to build relationships with superintendents so that they understood the added value, principals because it meant having teachers do one more thing, at least initially until they integrated into their practices. We had to get pre-K and kindergarten teachers to recognize the value. This was actually easier than not in most places because there's often a lot of attention paid to third grade and higher and not as much attention paid to the kindergarten, first, and second grade space. And many of them were happy to be given an evidence-based tool and to learn to use that in their classrooms. Because this is a project that links between the Department of Early Education and Care and K-12, there had to be understanding between those two departments. And our legislators, initially were nervous either about Big Brother and what was going to happen and how was the data going to be used, or they were excited to find out that we would be looking at our investments around early education and care. So helping them understand that this was the beginning of a process and was less about individual children at the state level and more about our progress in providing opportunities was important. And then higher ed was a critical partner because of this professional development. It's really not one-time professional development. It's ongoing professional development and training that's necessary. Individuals have to make sure they get child development. They need to learn how to observe, how to record, and then what you really want is for them to use the data to improve teaching and learning. And that's really done over time, not as one event. So our pilot in Massachusetts ended up including 22 districts. We focused on providing the tool to the teachers so that they could measure growth and individualize teaching. We provided them opportunities to give us a plan for professional development. And some districts are thinking about using that tool because it's comprehensive as a way to communicate with parents around how their children are doing over the kindergarten year. And as I said, the kindergarten entry assessment feels like a single project, but in order to be successful, there are many side projects. So one is to create this common metric that I keep talking about, much like OSEP for Indicator 7, that you would take these 3 formative assessment tools, collect data on children multiple times at the same point, 2 different tools, and then determine if there are constructs that are similar amongst them. So we're working on that work with NYU. We're starting with 4-year-olds because we don't have the kindergarten data yet, and over the next 3 years, we'll get a better sense of that. We also had to go back and look at our standards, and Catherine mentioned that. So we're working with Catherine at UNC and Columbia University, Lynn Kagan, to look at our standards to see if they're aligned between birth and kindergarten so that we can make those corrections that are necessary in order for that to be successful, and that the formative assessment is a part of that system. There were lots of objections when we talked about doing the kindergarten entry assessment. Some of them we've been able to address, some not as much. One is just time, and it was both time for professional development and time when your class sizes are large to really be able to collect and input the amount of data that's necessary for most of the online formative assessments. There was concern about data sharing we had to address. There was concern about alignment of the K-2 assessment. As you know, Park is looking at formative assessment for K-2, but aren't that far advanced. And so making sure what we were creating in Massachusetts would be flexible enough that it aligned with that as that development got done. There were actually people that were concerned this was being done out of a grant and that there wouldn't be a long-term commitment to the project. And so we had to ensure people that this wasn't something we were doing because of the grant, but in fact we believed it impacted teaching and learning, especially individualizing teaching and learning. There were costs for doing the professional development, and unions were concerned about this being an additional task, and I've mentioned the worry about appropriateness for assessing dual language learners. There were also lots of costs that even I don't think I anticipated when starting this off as a pilot, but the beauty of a pilot is discovering some of them. To do formative assessment, there's a fair amount of durable goods and tools you need in order to do that well, whether there's computers in the room for you to be able to enter the data or cameras to be able to document. Those things were necessary for teachers to be successful. We needed substitute teachers because we began some of the training prior to the end of the school year, or we needed money to reimburse teachers for doing additional professional development. There was a cost for the professional development. It takes a while to get strong capacity in your state around 3 assessment tools, so we often found ourselves working with the vendors. And then the Common Metric Project, which we were doing with NYU, needed funding as well. And we were really, pleased and able to do much of this because of the Race to the Top grant. The benefits to the state is that we get increased focus on individualized teaching and learning. We're real excited in districts where there's an alignment and an instructional tool between pre-K and kindergarten. We now will have a foundation for measuring growth in our youngest citizens from birth through kindergarten. It's great to see the shared practices between the community-based and school district programs. Our community-based programs have been using formative assessment since 05-06, and so as the kindergartens come into this mix, there's a lot of joint training and conversation that's going on, and it was great to be able to support the kindergarten teachers in this work as well. So questions or comments?
Sherry, thank you so much for enlightening us and informing us about what's happening in Massachusetts. We actually have a question that's come out of the chat, and I think we'll start with that one and see if we have time for a second. Can you tell us how you got buy-in and what were some of the challenges? And the third part of the question, how long did it take?
Yeah, so let me just say that buy-in came over time. That I talk about 22 school districts but there's 300 plus in our state. And it really was relationships, for the most part, that were built outside of the kindergarten entry assessment. And so when I think about superintendents, I wasn't able to, although we got some calls from people that we didn't have strong immediate relationships with that wanted to participate. Many of them had looked at formative assessment, and the districts with local funds are stretched to be able to afford it, so this was seen as an opportunity. But I would say you have to begin the relationships on lots of other topics before you go and ask individuals to do things. But our turn in the curve on not having a kindergarten entry assessment and having one or having a design was really about a 12-week process because of being a race to the top requirement. But I would say it's been about the last 3 years that I've been traveling the state and talking about assessment, not as an option, but as trying to understand what was necessary in order for people to do it. So I'd really say it's been 3 years of talking to community-based providers and kindergarten and public school about how do we do this assessment in a way that's developmentally appropriate, that's closest to meeting the needs of individualizing teaching and learning for children. And if we do that part well, we'll get the state information that we need.
Would you like to address any particular challenges that you've faced?
Well, the one challenge has been actually the professional development, because public schools often have a calendar of how they do their professional development. There's a lot rolling out around the Common Core right now, and so that's requiring some time and attention. I think we got caught up in this teacher evaluation space, which I wouldn't have ever chosen in terms of, is this something that can be used in teacher evaluation? And we think the answer to that is no. We want to stay in this process of continuing to learn, and formative assessments really aren't designed for that purpose. So, that's 2 or 3 of them, staying away from teacher evaluation and making sure that we could fit this into or add it onto all of the other demands that our teachers and superintendents and principals are currently experiencing.
Thank you for that. I'd like to take one more from Mary McPherson in the chat. What community-based providers, because we do know that there are participants listening and people who are on today who are actually community-based providers. So what community-based providers have been involved in Massachusetts, and how does coordination with these groups work?
So community-based providers since 0506 have either been giving training or resources or support. It started in our universal pre-K, which was more of a quality initiative that you had to be using one of those 3 formative assessments, but has grown now to lots of providers, and the idea of using an evidence-based formative assessment is in our quality rating and improvement system. And so there are lots of providers I could name that are using a formative assessment in the community-based programs, whether Head Start or Family Child Care or center-based. The work of coordination really does happen at the local level. So I'll use Springfield as an example. In Springfield, even prior to the kindergarten entry assessment discussion, there were lots of community-based providers that were using creative curriculum at the time, now Creative Curriculum Goal. And when Springfield had the opportunity in their preschool to pick up a formative assessment, they picked the one that lots of community-based providers were already using, and so have also used that in their kindergarten work. The same is true in, I think, Lawrence or Lowell in our state. So we try to work really hard to build local relationships between community-based early education, care, and after-school providers and the public school. And it's through those relationships, actually, that some districts made their choice. It wasn't required that they use the same one that the community base is using, because a lot of it, I believe, is about the skills, knowledge, and ability of the educator, which tool works best for them and what they're more comfortable with. Where, as an example, had already used work sampling at points and is now picking it up as an organized force to try to move forward with.
Thank you, Sherry. I think that was very informative for our participants. We know that there are several other questions in the chat, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to hold them till the end, and then we're also going to put together a Word document with some questions and answers, FAQs, and so we'd like to move on in the interest of time, and hopefully at the end we'll have all 3 presenters give us their comments as it relates to these particular questions. So let's just move on. Again, we've moved on to now the classroom perspective. So we're going to talk about using assessments in the early childhood classroom. And Jerry actually works in a small district in New Hampshire, and she has a totally different perspective because of what's actually happening in New Hampshire. Jerry St. Gelais is a kindergarten teacher and a librarian at the School Administrative Unit number 20 in Milan, New Hampshire. She's been a first grade teacher. She's been a teacher for the last 11 years, teaching both preschool and first grade. She's, as I understand it, she's moved from preschool to kindergarten to first grade, so she has that range of 3 years. Jerry has special skills in the area of technology and data collection and has been especially innovative in the area of classroom assessments. She also has experience developing lessons in all academic areas for students kindergarten through grade 6. She has a bachelor's degree from Southern New Hampshire University and a master's degree in education from Notre Dame College. So let's welcome Jerry to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm learning a lot as we go through this process. And I wanted to just talk about my background a little bit. As you mentioned, I'm from a very small school up in northern New Hampshire. I did teach first grade for years in a bigger district, but then I moved to this small town where I was the preschool teacher, the pre-kindergarten teacher, and the kindergarten teacher. And so the kindergarten entry assessment became very important to me because I really needed to know where to start with my students, where to start teaching for them. And at first, we didn't have really any formalized training. We've talked a lot about professional development. I kind of came into this and didn't have any professional development. So I felt sort of like I was making it up on my own, but I did feel that it was very, very important. So just to give a little background, New Hampshire is very different. We are the live free or die state, and we didn't have kindergarten in New Hampshire mandated until the fall of 2009. And that puts us the 50th state mandate kindergarten. And it's 20 years after the other states, after the other 49 states. And they're not actually, students are not required to attend kindergarten. We have to offer it, but there is no attendance requirement. So that puts a little bit of background there. My program right now is half a day, and it varies from place to place whether they're full day or half day. And so currently there is no standardized kindergarten entry assessment. So needless to say, I had to work on some things on my own. As Sherry was saying, it is really, really important to individualize education. And the KEA, specifically the math KEA one that they're working on, is very helpful with that goal. And I'm really happy to see that people at high up levels are realizing how important this assessment is, and for teachers and administrators to understand that too. I like the fact that the math KEA includes training for kindergarten teachers. I think that's really important. And also, Betsy talks about training the administrators just as far as the awareness piece of how important it is. And I also like that she says that they're training kindergarten teachers to use formative assessments because that will allow teachers to help students succeed throughout the whole year. Okay, so my suggestion is if you are in a state that doesn't have a KEA or they're not working on one or anything like that, don't wait. Go ahead and make your own assessment. Find an assessment that you think would work for you. See if you can get some funding for that. Or I didn't have funding for that, so what I ended up doing was just making up my own tool using free resources, Web 2.0 tools. But I do think a comprehensive assessment tool is vital, and we need to know where students are so that we can help them grow. So however you can manage to do it, it's worth the work. What I do is I determined what I wanted to know about my students before kindergarten even starts. So I was setting up the purpose of my assessment. So my original purpose was just to know where to start with my students, what I needed to teach. If they all know letters and sounds, I don't need to start there. But if half know letters and half know sounds, then I know my groupings and things like that. So that was my original intent. But thinking about it a little bit more through this webinar, it is also a transition piece. As they mentioned at the beginning, it is very important to transition the family and the students. So Catherine had mentioned it, that I get to meet the students, I get to meet the parents, and begin a working relationship with the family and the child. And that is key because students are nervous, parents are nervous. We want to set up that positive relationship with them right from the start. Okay, I created a kindergarten entry assessment on my own. And what I do is I meet one-on-one with students that are coming into kindergarten for like 20 to 30 minutes, depending on their ability, and I go through what they're able to do. Okay, so I kind of, on the next slide, it shows a lot of skills, and I won't go through them all because I think that we're all looking at the same kinds of skills. I'm basing mine on Common Core State Standards. It was previously based on the GLEs for the state, the grade level expectations, but it can also be based just on your curriculum. So if you're a teacher, whatever, or you're an administrator, whatever skills you're looking at, that's what you want to base your assessment on. So I do some early math activities, language arts activities. It's very important to look at gross motor and fine motor skills, and that does give me a screening as well. It lets me know if students have those skills. Visual motor skills are really important for reading later on. Visual discrimination is really important for that. Personal knowledge, if they know their names and addresses, and these days they need to know probably 3 different phone numbers. If they have good listening skills and if they're okay following directions, and also their communication skills. And that's like speech. It's a kind of a speech-language screening that I'm doing at the same time. All right, so with the next one, I'm kind of getting into specifically what I do because it is at the classroom level, so you can kind of see what my students go, what process they go through. So this is the data collection form that I created, and I just used Google Forms. It was really easy to create, and I use it for the entry assessment. And this is just an example, and it shows the students' names at the top, and I can do whatever normally during the kindergarten entry assessment, I will assess all of these skills. If the students are able to, you have to understand that from the teacher perspective, some students come in and don't want to say anything, or their parents are there and they act very different. Ideally, I would get through all of these skills. Okay, and I set up a scale of 1 to 5 so that it goes from below expected. So we say that we're looking at their birth date. And number 1 would mean that they don't know their birth date. So I ask them if they know their birth date, and they say no, I put a number 1. Number 2, they might know the season, they might know it's winter, so that would be like second out of the scale of 5, 1 to 5. The third one, number 3, might be that they know the month, but they're not the day. Number 4 on the scale would be that they know the month and the day. And students usually don't know it, but if they know all of that, then I try to teach them the year too. So number 5 would be that they know everything, the month, day, and the year. And that's just an example of how the scale works. You could set it up however you wanted. So let's see. I actually use this assessment all year. This is a base assessment that I use, and it collects data points for me throughout the year. So I think that's a lot what we've been talking about too, that you need to know the purpose of your assessment. Is it just a one-time assessment that you're going to collect data and use it for your incoming class or to report out to your school or to the state? I use mine for multiple purposes, so I do use it all year, and I keep assessing throughout the year. And I use my iPad or my iPod or my iPhone. You can use any mobile device to use this. All right, as we go to the next slide, this is the actual spreadsheet where all the data is collected. So it saves a lot of time. It's like Dana talked about there. Like Dana talked about, it's online. It's easy to access, and everything is right there for you to see. And I have 35 columns of data that I'm collecting.
I think that we just experienced a technical issue, so I'm just going to bring back up our presentation slides.
Okay.
Thank you, Dominique.
Here we go.
Okay. Can you see it? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so this is the spreadsheet.
Jerry, this is Jackie, if I could just ask you to slow down and take a breath.
Sure.
You have plenty of time, so I don't want you to be rushing because you think you don't have enough time.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm a little nervous, so. Okay, the next slide is the kindergarten entrance assessment process. Okay, and this is what it actually looks like on I usually use my iPod, and this is what I would actually see. So as you can see at the top, if you can see the names Dorian or Autumn, I would just check off, say that I'm doing Dorian. And I would check off, check off Dorian. Oops, I'm not sure what happened. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So I would check off Dorian, and then I would go through each item and check off on the scale of 1 to 5 what it is that they know and what it is that they don't know. So that's the data collection part of it. So it's pretty simple and easy, and as soon as I hit enter, it goes right into the spreadsheet, and you can see it's populated my 35 columns of data there. Okay. What I like about the Google Forms is that it already has these summaries and things built right into it. So this is talking about using the KEA data to inform my instruction. So if I look at my data, it comes already out in this chart for me. Right page. Okay, and just say that you're looking at the one with the orange where it's writing uppercase letters. Now remember, this is at the end of the year, so this is June, so it looks really good. This was, because it's continual throughout the year. In May, when I do my assessments, obviously there'll be a lot more students in the 1 and 2 range, but this was the end of the year data. So if I'm looking to see what students can write their uppercase letters, you could see that where the range is. So if I was going to be setting up groups, for this group right here, they're already writing all of their letters. So just imagine at the beginning of the year, it would look a lot different than that. And let's say that 50% couldn't write their letters at all. I know that's where I need to start. And I'll need to have a group of students at the very beginning going over letter formation, what a letter is, and really backing up. But if I have some in that 5 group that they can write all their letters, then we're going to get more into the letter sounds with them. So the way that I see this data helping me in the classroom is that I actually can take this and group my students based upon that. So I can, I'll have different levels of groups. And that, like Sherry had said, to individualize instruction, that means that I can have students working at, below grade level, but bringing them up to where they need to be. Then many students that are on grade level doing exactly what we would expect them to be learning in kindergarten. But then I'm also meeting the needs of the students that are at the high level. If they came in knowing all of this, I don't want to just check them off and say, great, they know all of the things in kindergarten, and not worry about them. I want to push them to their highest level. Okay, so some important facts about the kindergarten entry assessment. The kindergarten entry assessment can be created. Again, this is if you don't have one in your state. It can be created for free using open source tools, like any Web 2.0 tool, so that teachers can build assessments that fit their needs. Think about your needs. Think about why you're making the form. And the collection form and the data follow the student through grade levels. And that was mentioned by Sherry also, that they're actually collecting data, I believe she said, in preschool and pre-kindergarten. And we're trying to do that too. We're going through the process now of trying to get the preschool teacher is collecting data, and we're trying to move it on seamlessly from preschool up to pre-kindergarten and then to me in kindergarten. And then we kind of drop off some of the things that some of the skills that they already know, and then we kind of tweak it for first grade, move the information to first grade, and we're trying to get a preschool to second grade continuum going there, and that is ongoing. And the staff can edit the form as students progress, again, dropping off mastered items that you don't want to look at if they all know their name and they all know their birth date. You don't need to worry about that anymore, but you can add in some higher level goals. Okay, so ongoing assessment in kindergarten. I felt that this was just really, it fit in with the topic because as kindergarten teachers, you're going to be assessing all year long, where data is continually collected during class time. So, and I'll show you a video in a few minutes what I mean by that, but I'm always assessing students, and I think good teachers always are. And whether they're collecting the data or not, good teachers are always checking to see if students know what, understand the concept, and if not, reteaching it and giving them more practice. This is just a way to actually capture that data too. So assessment shouldn't interrupt learning. As they get into the older grades, I know there's a lot more testing involved. There's not standardized testing, but paper testing and things like that. But in kindergarten, in preschool, and pre-K, it's very different. You're assessing students as they're playing, as they're in center groups, as they're in reading groups. You really can't have them all stop and take a spelling test until maybe January or February. So assessment shouldn't interrupt the learning. It should be an integral part of the learning. Assessment data is collected during all activities, from whole group lessons and even to the playground. You can have them follow the leader and check on their physical skills while they're playing that outside. Multiple data points are collected for each item to ensure students' performance level over time. And I find that very important. I don't just assess things one time. I'm always assessing to see if they can they skip today, can they skip tomorrow. I think it's really important for them to know, especially for special needs students, because sometimes they can do something and then the next day they can't. So we'll have a graph of data for them to see if they've really mastered the skill. And real-life assessments show if transference of skills is taking place. So in other words, if we're working on retelling a story, like that's the goal of our lesson, and we read a story out loud, then their center might be the puppet theater. so that I would go over and watch, or maybe have a student videotape or something as they're retelling a story, and that would let me know if they really can retell a story. Not can they just answer questions about it, but actually when it's in their own words, in their own medium, can they tell the story back. Another example of that is to see if their transferring skills is explaining how to count backwards to a peer. You know, if we're working on counting backwards, we do it with hands-on manipulatives, we do it with some number cards, and then I try to have them help each other. And that works really well, but it also lets me know if students are able to teach other students and how much they really understand that. Next, I'd like you to see a video of what it looks like in the classroom. And as you'll see in the video, I just have my iPod. I'm just assessing quickly as we go. I have a reading group, and there are 23 students in the class, so there is a lot of background noise, and they're in different learning centers. They might be in math or reading or puppet show or even at the sand table. But you can kind of see what I'm assessing as we go, and then I'll show you what the information looks like after. So if you wouldn't mind running that clip.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jerry. And before we move to the video, I just want to remind everyone that the audio for the video will be playing through your computer speaker. So for all our participants, make sure you turn your computer speakers up really high. And I just want to remind all our presenters to put their phone lines on mute and to turn on their computer speakers as well. And for our participants who are joining in the overflow room, we will actually post the link for you to watch the video as we're watching it as well.
That we just did. We put together some sounds and we made a word, but now we're just going to try it out loud, okay? So I'm going to give you a word, and you're going to tell me the 3 parts of the word. Are you ready? Alexa's going to go first, and you're going to go like this. You're going to go wet for the word wet. Good. Wet. Okay, you're going to try the word dog.
Dog. Good.
And then put it together.
Dog.
Good. You're going to try the word pet. Excellent. Okay, and you're going to try the word rat. We're working on is identifying phonemes and seeing if they can identify their phonemes, if they can isolate the first sound and the last sound, and segment the sounds for me. So I'm going to try Hannah now. Okay, so I'm going to move over to Hannah. Ape. And the E doesn't say anything. So it's going to be ape. 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 Very good. And I'm going to have you mix it up and try again, okay? All right, we're going to move over to Alexa. Alexa, you want to show me one? Okay, let's try.
Okay, we can now return to the presentation room, and presenters can unmute their phone lines.
Great, are we all set?
Yep, go ahead, Jerry. You can move to the next slide.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so this just shows some of the data that I collected in that 1-minute video clip. There is lots of valid data that can be collected while you're actually teaching. It didn't take away from my teaching time at all. I did have my focus planned out ahead of time. I was working on phonemic awareness, and I had the spreadsheet already made up ahead of time based on the Common Core state standards. So it took a little bit of prep work for that, but if you can look at the data that some of the data that I collected throughout that lesson, it's just really quick, and the kids really don't even know that I'm collecting data. So that it's just, I really like it a lot. It gives me a lot of data to go back to, and I'm not relying just on my own memory. All right, so the next slide is about using data to enhance learning. So I use the data to help teach students at their own level. High students are challenged, and when we hit a benchmark, we just keep challenging them. So this was just an example of we were in math class, during math lessons, we were working on counting by tens, because that's one of the standards in the Common Core state standards. So if you look at the column that says count by tens, we were doing an activity, that was the lesson of the day. The students had to group things in piles of 10 and count by tens and help each other. So I just walked around and quickly assessed to see which students could count to 100 by 10. And that gave me a lot of good data. Now, I wasn't able to go right then and change my lessons. I just did the regular lesson for the day. But that afternoon, I just took a few minutes to look at my data and realized, okay, I have a lot of students that can count to 100 by tens, no problem. So what do I want to do? I'm just going to add on some columns and have them count by twos, count by thousands, and challenge them and also give me some data to keep track of what they're able to learn. It also gave me the data that the students that couldn't count to 100, where they were stuck, what they needed to understand for tens, and gave me some background work. So the next day for math lessons, and even when we come in the morning, we have a few minutes of free time as the kids are, well, not free time, I put things on the table, so a few minutes of transition time, I just put the counting by 10 activities at their seats and then kind of retaught some of that to the students that needed it. And then I had some students come up and teach the class how they did it. We had a class discussion. How did you count to 100 by 10? What did you do? We kind of went through that. But it just helps me, the data that I collect helps me to meet the students at every level and make sure that they're really understanding the goals. All right, for this, I know access to data is really important. Data is readily available, especially if you're using an online tool that can be shared. Data can easily be shared with involved staff by sharing the form. Through Google Forms, you just actually hit a share button and email it to them. And everyone has access to the real-time data. You can set up your form so that others can just view if you have parents or somebody working with them that you just want to view. Or you can actually set it up so they have editing rights. You would have to carefully choose who can actually enter data and who cannot enter data, or who can just look at it. But it helps us to collaborate with other people in the school. For this slide, I just had a picture. We went to the local fire station, and I just wanted to make the point of if the data is real or if it's contrived. We're always working on students learning their address and phone number, and that's really important to us. I'm not sure the students understand why it's so important. So when we go to the fire station, I had asked the captain to ask the students, where do you live? So he just said it just like that, and he asked each child in a different way. Where do you live? What street do you live on? You know, can you tell me your phone number? And it was really interesting seeing if they could understand the question, if they were able to give him the information that was necessary. If they had to call 911, would they understand the person on the other end? So is data real or is it contrived? And what are we really trying to teach them? And this just shows a picture of that data does drive my instruction. Most teachers are like that. You teach something. In this instance, we're outside for a field day, a woods day, and we were working on the 5 senses. So specifically, we're working on animal hearing for this one. And I read a book about how animals hear and the different uses for that. We played a game on the picture on the right. We were playing a game about animal hearing. But I could tell from the game that some students understood what the concept was and that some could not understand it exactly. So then the picture on the left just is me going over it with one of the students, explaining what exactly I meant, what the animal could hear, what you're supposed to do in the game if you could hear it, and then we play the game again. So data is always driving my instruction. This time I wasn't writing it down. I wasn't collecting the data. I was just using it in my head. But when I went back after that, I could remember some of what happened that day to assess, and some I could not. Data drives my instruction. So data helps me make learning groups of students with similar needs. And I think that's a key these days, is to use the data that you have to actually do something with the data. I'm getting into, this is the first year of the math group. So I actually have students that are in high, medium, and low math groups, but just based on certain concepts. So the groups are different weekly, depending on what my math lessons are for that week. And that's really working out well. Most people do that with reading groups, and they change the students through groups as the data shows, you know, what they understand, what they don't understand. But you can use groups for everything, for science, for math, for social studies, you know, for anything at all that you have. And if you get that formative data, if you get the formative assessment through a quick activity, and then collect the data, and then at least it takes, you know, a day or like a little while after school gets out to look at the data you collected and then make your group for the next week or so. Data determines what lessons the whole class needs, because there are certainly times that you're doing a lesson or you're going over something and the whole class is learning it. So the most effective way is to teach whole class. But it also determines which students need one-on-one instruction, and sometimes they just need one-on-one instruction for 2 minutes just to clarify something, and then they're all set. Sometimes they need one-on-one instruction because they're really so much further behind than the other children, and they just need that one-on-one support. Data helps each student to reach their full potential. I think that benefits of the KEA and of the ongoing assessments is that learning continues. It doesn't stop for assessment. It's actually built in. Data helps track student progress over time. And data is available for all learning goals. You can make up any, assessments for your learning goals for everything as you go along. Each student works on their own learning goals, kind of like we talked about, that individualized education. I think about it like every student has their own IEP. It's not formally written, but as you go through the concepts and you look at the data collected, you're actually creating an IEP for each student for each goal. And no more teaching to the middle. You're actually seeing what this class needs. So each year, instruction is different. It's not the same every year. Your curriculum is the same and the standards are the same, but your teaching of how you get those points across to the students is always different based upon your students. So what now? Educators just must streamline their assessments to match their instructional goals. Massachusetts is already far ahead in that. Some other states are really working on it. And so if you're in a state like that, you're lucky. If not, you need to find out what your goals are. Are they Common Core state assessments? Is it your curriculum? Figure out what you would like to assess. An assessment has to be built into instruction to maximize learning time and because of the age of the students. If you have availability for Google Forms, or Web 2.0 tools, you can use free resources that you can customize without having budgetary constraints, and to analyze and use the data to inform your instruction. And I hope that was helpful from the teacher perspective. Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Jerry. I think it was helpful and gave people very practical, down-to-earth suggestions of how to get started in their own classrooms and then what to use with the data. I have one question that I'd like to pose to you, and then we have time, so it looks like we'll be able to move into the larger discussion forum where we'll ask the presenters to actually respond to participant questions. So, Jerry, here's your one question that someone submitted. How do you help teachers move from simply gathering this data to utilizing assessment data to enhance practice and to impact child outcomes?
Okay, great. And it is a matter of experience, I think. The first few years that you're teaching, you're really just teaching, and it's very hard to get this fit into your actual teaching, to be able to use the assessment as you go along. But as you become more practiced, more fluent with teaching, you just you can find out what students need. You can focus on, you actually do a quick formative assessment, find out what they need, and then you then collect some more data. So say that you're working on calendar concepts. You're going to make actually during a class activity, you could actually just be doing calendar, have some students come up, talk about the calendar, answer some questions, and that's your quick assessment right there. Then you determine which students are at the beginning level, which students are in the middle level, and which students are advanced. Once you've collected the data, it just takes a little bit of time at first, and it gets much quicker after. But collect your data, put in who understands the months, who understands the days, who understands the years, the specific things that you're noticing, and then you go ahead and make up either classroom groups or whole class lessons or activities to have for each student at each level. So it is a little bit of planning. And every morning when I come in, I look at my math lesson and I say, okay, math lesson today is calendar. That's what I'm going to focus on. I make a quick little assessment, or you could even use a checklist on a piece of paper. This is what I'm assessing. Make some quick little check marks as the students are doing their activities. And then after the students have gone, that's when you look at your data and plan. And it doesn't have to be a big lesson, but you plan your follow-up lesson for the next day.
Jerry, thank you so much for giving us some very practical procedures to follow in starting to develop assessments and using them in our particular classrooms.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is, our presenters are still here, so what I'd like to do is, as part of the wrap-up, I'd like to ask questions of the different presenters and speakers today, and I'd like to begin with Sherry, because we saw this question scroll up in the chat, Sherry, so I'd like to pose the question of, how does your KEA system work with English language learners?
Yeah, thank you. We really expect our use of formative assessment that will roll up into a picture of kindergarten entry to work with all children, including those that are non-English speaking. And it requires professional development at the first level, making sure that teachers can understand what children and families are presenting to them. Also, it requires us to understand whether we're trying to understand whether the children have the content that's required or the ability and knowledge to speak English. But at the foundation, there is not really good tools for assessing those differences. And so as a state, we're really pushed forward around the family engagement. We're talking about making sure that we're seeking information from families as we're doing this assessment, working on teacher training around professional development, and then continue to work with the larger field and people like Catherine around creating good tools that help us differentiate between core knowledge regardless of language background and the ability to speak English.
Thank you, Sherry. Catherine, do you have anything to add about English language learners?
I would just add that I don't think we can underestimate the complexity around issues related to assessment for English language learners, both from a research and a theoretical perspective, because we know that language affects so many aspects of children's development, but also from a practical perspective and teachers and the challenges that they face if they don't speak the child's language. So we do have a lot of work to do in this area.
Thank you. I'd like to move to another topic and begin with Catherine. Catherine, if teachers create their own tools, how do you know whether it's appropriate and valid?
Well, I think part of that question causes us to back up and really think about our purposes. And the teacher-created instruments, like Jerry has so wonderfully described, are really for the purpose of instruction. And so they're not going to have the same kind of data that a formal assessment would have. So if I were a teacher and I was looking for some kind of credibility around what I'm doing, I think a good starting point, as Jerry pointed out, is the standards. So first off, kind of the validity of the content that I'm going to assess. And then I do agree with Jerry in terms of implementation. It does have something to do with experience. And so if I were a teacher creating an assessment, I would want to make sure that either I had a lot of training and experience in assessing children, or I was leaning on someone, tapping into some resources and support to make sure that my implementation was good. So standards might be a starting point for content, resources such as training and support for implementation. And then I think that reflection is an important part of a teacher's process in terms of making sure that because at that point it's really yours and you're implementing it, so you're kind of an N of one, but that you are both valid and reliable in what you're doing. And so thinking about, am I doing this the same way for all children? Am I doing this the same way across time? Is this really giving me information that is useful to me? Because that's an aspect of validity. So it's really sort of a very different way of thinking about reliability and validity, but is critically important for teachers who are doing their own classroom-based assessments.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd just like to ask Jerry to speak a little bit on what do you base your content for your KEA, and how do you ensure that reliability and validity? One of our participants asked that question, Jerry. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I think it's really important because I was using, I was dabbling in other programs that I had access to throughout the district, but I had no training in them. So I kind of pulled questions from lots of different standardized assessments and then also from my Common Core state standards. And it is difficult to come up with your own assessment and see if it's valid. And like she had mentioned, it's useful for me as a teacher, so I'm working with that. Basically, I'm going off of what's useful for me. So if it was going to be statewide or something like that, I think validity is very important. We're working with just a small group of teachers in a small school, like 4 teachers. And we're working together to collect data too, and we are coming up with some issues of how are we assessing this exactly? What does a 3 mean to you? What does the scale mean to you? So I do see that that is an issue, and that's something that we need to work on.
Thank you so much. We also have another question, because our focus seems to have been, really we focused on the academic skills. So this is the question for each of you to answer. We'd appreciate your perspectives. How do you assess the social emotional learning that affects the individual child and sometimes the whole class?
Right. One of the reasons, this is Sherry from Massachusetts, that we pick the formative assessment tools we pick is that they do assess all 5 domains of learning. It was critical when I talk about traveling the state, talking about assessment, that that would be a part of what we were doing. So we're in no way wanting to focus only on academic skills. In fact, we're using evidence-based tools because they cross the multiple domains.
And this is Catherine. I'll just add, although there are examples of states that are focusing their kindergarten entry assessment on academic areas, particularly language and literacy and mathematics, they certainly are out there. The race to the top from a policy perspective actually required that kindergarten entry assessments address all domains. So, it's a pendulum that swings. And certainly all developmental domains are equally as important in terms of what we're doing with our kindergarten entry assessments.
And as far as in my kindergarten class, it is very difficult to assess social emotional issues. I felt making up a test on my own, where I'm working with students one at a time. So I do a lot more observational things when we are in class, how they get along with their peers, how they handle situations and things like that. So that's more ongoing assessment for me, and it's not specifically part of the KEA.
Thank you so much for your responses. This question specifically for Sherry. Could or should the KEA be used prior to the fall entry date in order to identify students who may benefit from additional support prior to the start of the school year? For example, summer support.
Right. Again, the KEA in our state is a continuum of what has gone on for children in preschool. And so if children are enrolled in formal early education and care programs, they should be continuously involved in this kind of formative assessment that's supporting and developing their growth. I think certainly if districts are able to, or early education and care programs are able to provide opportunities in the summer, using a formative assessment would be useful, but usually those programs are 4 to 6 weeks, and the time it takes to build a relationship with the child, to be able to do authentic observation, and then intervene, sometimes these larger tools are more difficult to do, especially if you don't have a whole day. So the formative assessments usually work when you're expected to be with the child for a longer period of time. We would hope if they're coming from a preschool space and they don't have a summer opportunity that those providers are sharing with the parents the kinds of activities they need to be doing so they continue to get ready. The other thing is there's no ready score. There's the idea that children are developing along a domain and some children need more opportunities than others in order to close that gap. So there's also not a cut score that you're trying to get to. We want all of our children all summer to continue to learn. I think the National League of Cities in their Reading by Fourth Grade campaign and their work around summer learning and preschool and attendance continues to make that point, that especially for young children, they're in fact learning all the time, and anybody that can help parents understand what those opportunities should be is helpful.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to add anything on that particular topic?
I think Sherry's covered it. I mean, you really have to think about the logistics and how much teachers can actually observe and when they can best observe that, and carefully think about that as you're planning.
Thank you. And I just want to remind participants before I ask this final question that there will be something sent out, a Word document sent out that will have questions and then follow-up. So that will help participants also if we don't answer your question in particular. And this final question is for Sherry. Can you talk about why the state decided against some common statewide assessments to facilitate across-community comparisons? How well do you think you'll be able to do that with district choices?
Yeah, great question. Whoever asked has never been to Massachusetts, so getting everybody to do one thing is more more difficult than one might imagine. So that's the silly answer. The truth is that all of the formative assessment tools that are available right now have their strengths and weaknesses. And for that reason, I didn't have enough evidence in looking at reliability and looking at how they're implemented that one was necessarily better than the other. The question is still out on whether or not we will be able to come up with constructs from the three of them that are similar, that give us a picture of our kindergarten readiness across the state. That's the work that we'll do over the next couple of years with NYU, and there are some that think that we're not going to get to that. I think we will find 2 or 3 domains where we can have an understanding of how children are doing and what opportunities the state needs to keep making available in order to advance that learning. And finally, it goes back to teacher choice. Teachers develop, they have preferences. If you use work sampling, for instance, it's really observational and portfolio-based. And if that's not your style of learning, if that's not what you want to be engaged in, that requires a lot more reflection than I think creative curriculum goal might require, then that may not be the tool for you. And so we also don't want to make the assumption that one is necessarily better than the others or that we all use tools in the same way. Catherine, Catherine, do you have thoughts about that the difficulty of states picking a single tool?
Yes, I'll just echo what you said. There is no perfect instrument, and there are multiple needs and multiple priorities that you have to balance. And I think that Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, as they're trying to figure this out, while it's quite a conceptual challenge, if it can be managed, will be really an asset for the field to figure out how we can have choice and yet also have reliable, valid, comparable data.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And before we close, I would just like to ask each of our speakers if they have a final word for us. So let's begin with Jerry. Jerry, do you have a final word that you would like to share with the participants?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and I think it's really fascinating to learn all of this about KEAs and ongoing assessments and reliability and validity. And I've learned a lot through the process, so thank you for including me.
And we'd like to thank you for agreeing to participate. We know how it can be particularly stressful. It's been stressful for me. This is my first job at moderating. So Sherry, would you like to add your final words?
Yeah, I just encourage you to keep children at the center and recognizing their parents as first teachers, as both a place to get information as well as a place to provide information. And I say parents and other caregivers. And that whatever you do around this assessment needs to be in service of creating opportunities for children. And when we do that well, states will have information. I saw one of the questions was about a centralized data system, and that's a whole nother webinar, and we can talk about that. But if we get this right about assessing children so that we can individualize the learning opportunities for them and what their parents should be doing for their growth and development and how we manage that in formal settings, we'll be halfway there.
Thank you. Catherine, we'll give you the last word before I have to do the wrap-up in the...
Well, I would just say that we have talked about a number of different approaches. We've talked about different challenges and considerations. And I think within all of that, to keep in mind that we have some guiding principles, and we do the best that we can to implement those guiding principles, whether we're assessing children at the classroom level or at a broader scale. But not, as Sherry said, lose sight of the reason we're doing it and the potential benefits, because the challenges are pretty significant. But I think the potential benefits really are what, if we keep our focus on that, can help us move through these challenges. And you've heard some great examples of at the classroom level and the state level where people have kept their eye on the prize, if you will, and one foot in reality and another foot in best practices, and keep moving forward.
Thank you, Catherine. I would like to personally thank these 3 extraordinary professionals who have come forward on a July afternoon to share with us very pertinent information for our field. I'd also like to thank Kyle DeMeo-Cook, who's actually sitting next to me and shooting me the questions and assisting me. She's really been awesome, and it's really made my first moderating experience heavenly. I want to remind you that we will have this ongoing conversation. We will plan bridge events as we move forward, so please be checking the REL site periodically, and it's my understanding that now you're on our list, so that may be good for you. We want you to know that there will be, as I said before, a document with questions and answers going out, and that you're also able to download resources. There's a file pod in the lower left-hand corner of your particular screen, and you can download resources there. We do have an evaluation survey link. It's in the chat. Dominique has put it in the chat for us, and it's also here on this last slide. Please make sure that you complete the survey. It really helps us to move our work forward and to helps us with our accountability for the United States Department of Education. So again, I would like to thank you for and for any further information, you certainly can go to the REL website, which is posted here on the last slide. And I've also put the contact information for Anne-Marie Ferrier. As I said, she's a researcher on this project. Kyle DeMeo-Cook, also working as a researcher on this project. And my email address, Jackie Barassa, is there. I'm the facilitator for this alliance. We thank you, and we hope that you'll join us the next time. Please remember that all these particular documents will be archived, and there will be an archive for this particular website. The audio will also be archived. So if anyone has any questions, please email one of us, and we'd be more than happy to either forward them to the speakers or to answer them ourselves if it's that kind of question. Thank you, and we hope you'll join us next time.